Welcome. We are thrilled today because we have some special people here that are going to give us some excellent information that will help us know how to tailor our diet to do lots of things, build health, work on sustainability, think about the climate, think about the animals, all those reasons that people go and change their diet where they're eating plants instead. We'll have some people with here to help us with that. And we're doing it because of a new book that was just published, Plant Powered Protein. So let's find out who's here. Well, first of all, many of you already know her, Brenda Davis. She's one of our speakers today. And Brenda, can you just give a quick synopsis of who you are? I mean, we know you from Chat and Chew, but Laura, one of our speakers that's going to ask some questions, she doesn't know you. So give us an update.
Yeah, well, I'm a registered dietitian, have been for, I think, about 40 years now. My key areas of expertise are plant-based diets, vegetarian and vegan diets, and lifestyle medicine has become something I've become very interested in, and I'm working a lot in that realm as well. So speaking at VegMed actually on the weekend. And so I've written 13 books to date, most of them co-authored, some of them not. And again, the books are really about how to put together a plant-based diet that will work at every stage of the life cycle, how to avoid any of the potential pitfalls, and how to construct a diet so it'll minimize the risk of chronic disease as well. I've also written 3 books on diabetes and using plant-based diets as a treatment for type 2 diabetes. So that's just a little bit about my story.
And you didn't tell the best part. That is that when you present at places like MedHealth that you're going to do this weekend?
Yeah, VegMed.
VegMed. I knew it had med and veg in there together. Anyway, if there's doctors there, they listen to Brenda. And they give her standing ovations. And that's just, we all listen to her, but the doctors listen to her too. So that's really exciting. Okay.
Well, and this will be interesting to Laura. When I first went plant-based, it was certainly at least 35 years ago, maybe a little more. I was terrified because I didn't know if there was another plant-based dietitian on the planet. And I thought I was just going to be ousted from the profession. So at that time, I kind of made a promise to myself that I would just be very evidence-based in everything I say, be very respectful to my colleagues, and work within the profession to the best of my ability. And I've been privileged. I think I've spoken in probably close to 25 countries now, and many of them at national dietetic conferences and many medical conferences as well. So that's also part of the story. So it was an interesting journey, but it was always even better than I thought it would be, because I think most of my colleagues were really grateful to have guidelines that they could use for their patients and or their clients and feel really comfortable with them. So that's really been the focus of my work.
And since we've started talking about Laura is one of our other ones that's going to ask questions. Laura, tell Brenda and Cory a little bit about yourself so they'll be familiar.
Absolutely. Thank you for inviting me today. I have been a dietitian as long as you have, just about 36 years. In October, I will have taken the exam. So I have worked mostly in long-term care as a clinical dietitian. For the last almost 12 years, I've been teaching at Keiser University, educating people to become dietitians. And now that the master's is required to enter the field, we are teaching distance grads from around the country who come to us for their master's degree and their internship. So I get to meet them once at the beginning of their program for a week, and then they go to where they live and they complete their education to be dietitians. I embarked on the whole foods plant-based journey. And I'm not, I mean, I still eat a little bit of dairy and everything, but I did embark on it because of the inquisitiveness of my students. They were really prompted to study a whole foods plant-based diet at the time that Forks Over Knives came out. And we did a lot of education on that. And that's how Kathy and I met. Our students were so interested and we found each other. And so it's been really a great journey. And
wonderful. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that, Laura. Really interesting to hear about all the students and their interest and your work with them and your openness to considering some of their arguments too. And yeah,
absolutely.
changing. Yeah, it's really quite amazing. I honestly never would have thought, when I started all of this, that we would be where we are today. And the interest would be so great. So it's really exciting to
It really is. I mean, the evidence is incontrovertible, really.
Yes, absolutely.
Definitely there. And Laura is also in school because what are you doing, Laura? You're working on
I'm working on my doctorate in education right now. I actually take my comprehensive exams next week. So,
oh, good luck.
thank you.
That's a big job.
so we're glad she's here because she'll ask some questions that'll have a different perspective. But now the newbie that we're all excited to get to know and chat to is Cory. That's Brenda's son, Cory Davis. And Cory, can you give us a brief overview of who you are and how you became one of the authors of this book?
Well, thank you so much for having me. First of all, it's quite a privilege to be here, and I'm thrilled to chat with you folks. Cory Davis, I'm a professional agrologist by trade and also have been working in natural resource development for over 10 years. Been an activist for as long as I can remember, from the 2004 Compassion for Animals road expedition to working with the Responsible Animal Care Society. This has been a focus of my attention. And it wasn't until the Compassion for Animals road expedition in 2004 that I really started to put my mind towards environmental sustainability and the food that we eat. When I was giving, and I was only about 14 or 15 years old at that time, started to talk about meals that people can cook easily that are environmentally sustainable, going around the United States giving cooking demos at all kinds of different venues for that. And over the course of my career, in my academic history, I started in the social sciences. So that's always been a focus for me. And then I transitioned into land use planning, environmental land use planning, environmental sciences, where I really had a good opportunity through the curriculum and my major projects to blend that social aspect and the scientific foundation for the environment to how it impacts people in our day-to-day lives, our well-being, our culture. And having been working in the natural resource sciences for about a decade, and that included a wide range of different things, from public safety as it relates to geotechnical hazards, to land use planning, to cattle ranching, forestry, mining, a whole suite of different natural resource operations. It gave me this really balanced perspective on the environment and our relationship to the land. And having been thinking about food for so long as an agrologist as well, just seemed like just the right time for me to provide some comment to the book and write about the environmental impacts of the food that we eat.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be such an interesting interview session because we've got, two people here that are really focused on the nutrition part of it, with what kind of protein we eat, and then you'll bring to it a nice broad look at not just what it does when we grow it in the, we farm, but how does it impact so many things, including the people. So thank you for coming, Cory. This was great. So I guess we need to start with the question. I know, Brenda, you hear it so much, and we all hear it if we're whole food plant-based. But where do you get your protein? And why in the world would you want to eat plants instead of just what we all eat is animals?
Yeah, my answer is always really simple. I just say I get my protein from plants. And then if time permits and people want to discuss this a little further, I explain to them that people probably need about 10 to 15% of their calories from protein, and that all whole plant foods exceed 10% of calories from protein, except for fruit and starchy vegetables. Legumes and non-starchy vegetables, it's close to 20 to 40% of calories. For most nuts, seeds, grains, they're in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% of calories. And so if you are eating predominantly whole plant foods and not a whole lot of oil and sugar, it's really easy to fall. And on average, people eating plants fall in that range of, it's usually around 11 to 14%, a little higher if they're more focused on the legumes. And if we look at studies that have compared protein intakes in plant-based eaters or vegetarians and vegans versus lacto-vegetarians versus omnivores, what we see is that we're all getting more than enough protein. Vegetarians, the one Adventist Health study that compares similar health conscious individuals, I think the numbers were about 75 grams a day for omnivores and 71 grams a day for lacto-vegetarians and vegans. And of course, most people are aware that the RDA is 46 grams a day for women and 56 grams for men. So all well above those numbers. And this doesn't mean that people can't get enough protein eating plants. Some people struggle a little more than others, but it really isn't that difficult to get enough protein from plants.
And there's an advantage to it?
Oh, there's a huge advantage. And in fact, what's really interesting is that, when you look at some of the studies that have compared protein sources and mortality, sort of mortality and morbidity rates, it's very interesting. And I think probably the largest study was an NIH study of over 400,000 individuals, and they reported, and this is just, to me, it's shocking, they reported a 10% drop in overall mortality when just 3% of calories from animal protein were replaced with plant protein. And to put this into perspective, 3% of calories in a 2,000 calorie diet would be 60 calories. That's less than one egg. Okay, so it's that tiny little replacement will drop mortality 10%. So I did the math because they actually quantified the impact looking at different types of proteins, whether it's red meat or eggs or dairy or poultry or whatever. And I calculated that if people replaced one large egg, 2 ounces of meat, and 1 cup of 2% milk per day, they could, according to this study, they would reduce the risk of mortality by about 54%. And this wasn't the first study that had these kinds of results. The first one that I am aware of is Dr. Song's study from 2016, and then there was another one that had even more shocking results from Japan. And these are all very, very large studies. And then if you look specifically at cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes or cancer, we see the same things. I know there was a study from the US, another 2020 study, that found that rates of heart failure were 2.5 times greater in the highest versus lowest quintile of animal protein intake, and 56% lower in the highest versus lowest intake of legumes. And for type 2 diabetes, there was a study out of Finland that showed replacing just 1% of calories, that's like 20 calories in a 2,000 calorie diet, dropped risk of 1% from animal protein with plant protein, dropped risk of type 2 diabetes 18%. And then the one, that study I mentioned from Japan, they looked at replacing 3% of calories from red meat with plant protein, and in their study they found a 50% drop in cancer mortality. Or I think it was, no, sorry, I think it was a 39% for red meat and a 50% for processed meat. So anyway, it was just huge. It was ridiculous numbers for this tiny little amount, 2 ounce, like 1 ounce of meat. So anyway, it's pretty convincing evidence.
Boy, is it? I mean, I love the way you put it in what that is in food. How little it is. That's amazing.
Yeah, and Kathy, the reason why we're seeing this, in my view anyway, is that plant protein foods, we're thinking about foods like legumes and split peas and lentils and chickpeas and tofu and these kinds of foods. These are, and particularly whole legumes, are very, very rich sources of some of the components in the diet that are most strongly linked to disease risk reduction. So you think about things like fiber and phytochemicals and antioxidants and plant sterols and prebiotics, and all of these very protective components legumes are rich sources of, and that's why we see, when we look at legumes and risk of mortality, we always see disease risk reduction. On the other hand, these sources contain very little of many of the components in meat that are associated with increased risk of disease. So, things like saturated fat and heme iron, which can be a pro-oxidant, and Nu-5GC, which is a pro-inflammatory molecule in meat, and heterocyclic amines and TMAO and its precursors, and endotoxins and chemical contaminants like POPs that move up the food chain. All of these things are much lower in plant protein sources than in animal protein sources. So not only are you providing more of the protective components, you're providing a lot fewer of the components that have been more strongly associated with increased risk.
That's increased risk of disease.
Of disease, exactly.
The diseases we're talking about are the ones Americans are dying from. The heart disease.
Yes, and not just Americans. 74% of the global population will die of a diet and lifestyle-induced chronic disease. So this is a global issue. I mean, it's high in the States and in Canada as well, but it is a global epidemic, chronic disease, for sure.
Okay, so we know that it makes a big difference if we eat more plants, especially legumes. So Cory, tell me, does it make a difference with all of those factors that you look at in your job, in your training?
Yes, just small reductions, shifts to more or less resource-intensive food products makes a massive difference from my perspective. And that's along metrics such as climate change, greenhouse gas emissions, land use, water use, and water pollution. Of course, when we purchase something from the market, oftentimes the grocery store has just-in-time supply chain logistics. So the moment that something comes across the cashier's space and gets put into the system, it tells that system to replace it, right? Because inventory space is very expensive. So when you do purchase something, it impacts that supply and demand. And so I want the listeners to know that what you purchase does make a difference in terms of those supply and demand logistics. Inventory space is very expensive. And for every resource-intensive food product, there are alternatives that are not. Alternatives that could drastically reduce your impact. So we could get into that more specifically if you would like, or I could leave it there for you.
Well, why don't we do, let's see, which one does it, beef? What does beef impact the most?
Oh, the most. Potentially land use would be impacted the most. And to say land use in a silo wouldn't do it much justice, because of course, land use is also associated with water use or water supply, greenhouse gas emissions. And I'll give you an example. The forest, we currently deforest about 5 million hectares per year. And of course, there's the question, well, what is the opportunity cost of converting carbon sink ecosystems into carbon sources? So of course, our forests have immense capacity to withdraw greenhouse gas emissions, namely carbon dioxide, from our atmosphere and sequester it. So what is that impact of removing it? Well, some studies have suggested that it's quite immense. It's an immense impact. So our forests have a lot of capacity to help us deal with climate change. Well, we are deforesting it quite rapidly. 5 million hectares a year is quite a lot. And about 75% of that deforestation is related to agriculture. Well, the amount of tree cover lost by cattle alone, just for their pastures, this doesn't include the feed crops. Of course, cattle in Canada eat a lot of barley, in the States, a lot of corn. They're fed soy byproducts and so forth. These all contribute to that deforestation, but just for pasture. And pasture are areas of land that cattle use to forage for grass. Just for your knowledge, about 36% of all agricultural tree cover loss, deforestation, is to create new pasture. I believe between 2001 and 2015, it was about 45 million hectares of forests were lost for pasture creation. One study came out just a couple years ago now that suggested if we were to globally go vegan, which is a huge, ambitious statement, but it was assessed, and rewild all of that land, we would potentially sequester 16 years worth of greenhouse gas emissions from the livestock sector alone. And so that's quite impactful. But of course, when we talk about forest cover, we're also talking about water supply, because tree cover has been identified as a major impact for what could replenish our regional local water sources. So through this process of evapotranspiration, where trees take up water from their roots and releases it through their leaves, it increases atmospheric moisture and the cross-continental transport of that moisture, which is vital and integral to replenishing our water supply, especially in the summer and especially in interior regions. And so those things are all connected. And of course, with climate change, which of course agriculture plays a significant role in, we're seeing more and more droughts. And this year was a really good example of a drought year for British Columbia, where I am. And we often focus on local solutions to local drought issues, but really, when we zoom out and look at it through a systems lens, it is a bigger, broader issue that integrates many different fields, such as hydrology, tree cover, and direct emissions, and land use. What is the potential of the land to sequester those emissions?
And you know, as you're talking, all I can think about is the Amazon. I mean, we all have that concern about the Amazon. And I want to point out in the book, there are excellent charts. And if it's okay, I think I'm going to put up some of those that in this next section, we'll put a gap here and have them there, that actually look at each kind of a protein. And you've done a great job of showing which ones have the biggest impact on water and land and climate, all those options. So that can expand on what you're teaching us. But gosh, just the land has so many, it's a web, isn't it? It really is.
It really is. So direct emissions, I mean, what we could say is, if we want to look at emissions from each different food category, certainly beef has one of the largest emissions, about 50 kilograms of carbon per 100 grams of protein, whereas tofu is about 2. We often talk about, we often hear about the transport sector and their greenhouse gas emissions. When we talk about global warming, we're often talking about, well, drive less, right? And switching to, and the transport sector as a whole is approximately 12 to 13% of the total greenhouse gas emissions coming from the tailpipes of those vehicles, not necessarily production. And similar with animal agriculture as a whole, you see figures 14.5% all the way up to 80 some percent. So we really don't know, but at a minimum, it would be comparable to what's coming out of the tailpipes of all trains, planes, and automobiles. Personal transportation is about 8% of total greenhouse gas emissions. If you were to switch from a conventional vehicle to a hybrid, they estimate that it will save about 46% in greenhouse gas emissions. Well, switching from beef to legumes, you could achieve a 98% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from that switch. Small changes in how we eat is potentially the cheapest and most effective way that we could reduce emissions if we're looking for those big reductions. The relative reduction is just massive.
So it's there. Plant protein is the smarter choice, and the more we can eat, the better off we are in lots of ways. Now, Brenda, I was going to ask you, because I love the way this book is designed so that you can look up the age that you're interested in with plant protein and your
Yes.
health. And one that caught my eye was the one on athletes.
Mm-hmm.
That one, I think we'll have people in Chat and Chew that'll be interested, because you go into detail about how much protein athletes will need. And of course, these are athletes that really participate in sports and training compared to a regular person. Can you talk a little bit about protein needs for athletes and where?
So this is, important caveat is we're not talking about people that, exercise for an hour a day or, are just doing that kind of, they're physically active individuals. We're talking here about competitive athletes who are training for a few hours a day and working really hard. And of course, their protein needs will depend on what type of training they're doing, how hard they're training, where they're at in their training. But generally, we don't actually have a separate RDA, recommended dietary allowance for athletes. But many of the, sort of expert, like the American College of Sports Medicine, Dietitians of Canada, Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, they do have position statements on what is an appropriate range of protein for athletes. And most of them agree it's somewhere between 1.2 and 2 grams of protein per kilogram per day. And for adults, it's 0.8 grams per kilogram per day. So it's really significantly higher intakes that are required. And what a lot of people don't realize is that athletes also require a lot more calories. And so it's not, it's so interesting, because if you look at someone who's consuming, 3,500 calories a day, if they get 120 grams of protein, that's a lot of protein. It's less than 14% of calories for them. It's really typical of people eating plant-based diets. So for most athletes, just that increase in energy intake or calorie intake will take care of the additional protein required. People in the sports world get really concerned about protein, and they get quite, stuck on, how do I get enough protein, and, all of these protein smoothies and so on. And that can help in some situations, because not everyone consumes that number of calories. So there may need to be a little more focus on protein, but generally you're talking about eating a little more tofu, a few more beans, including some protein with your snacks, which is pretty easy to do. But the folks that it's really much more challenging for is seniors. So most of the international organizations and several countries, including Australia and the Nordic countries and even Germany, there are several countries that actually have separate recommendations, protein recommendations for seniors. And most of the expert groups as well are recommending generally about 1 to 1.2 grams per kilogram body weight for seniors. And this is, often 20-25% above the standard RDA. And for seniors, they tend to be eating fewer calories than other adults. They're less active, and so this is a much bigger challenge for seniors, in my opinion, than it is for athletes who are eating a lot of calories. So for seniors, they really do need to be eating quite a nutrient-dense diet and focusing a little more on protein than what younger adults might have to do. And although, it's not 100% agreement that seniors need that amount of protein, we seem to be moving in that direction. And there's definitely some evidence that it may help to reduce risk of sarcopenia and frailty and so forth. Now, what's really interesting, veering off into seniors, is that several studies have shown that the risk of sarcopenia and frailty and all of these things is actually lower when the protein is coming from plants than it is when the protein is coming from animals. And in fact, there are 2 studies from the UK that showed lower protein intakes resulted in less sarcopenia. So a lot of people waved that banner. But the interesting thing was in those studies is that most of the protein was coming from animal sources. And they showed better results when people were getting their protein from plants as well. And you would say, why? Well, I think it may be because when you get your protein from plants, there's less inflammation, there's less oxidative stress, there's, more of all of those protective phytochemicals and so on that the folks are consuming. They tend to be a little, less likely to be obese. And so there may be less inflammatory cytokines being produced. There's all sorts of possibilities. But generally, we see pretty good results with plant proteins for seniors. It's just that plants are less concentrated sources of protein. So then we have to refigure a little bit, how we're going to get those protein needs met, especially when people, as seniors tend to like to eat, easy to prepare foods, and it can be a little more challenging. Tea and toast just don't cut it. We need to be putting some beans on the toast and having tofu for dinner and those kinds of things.
Well, Brenda, since I spent most of my career in long-term care, sarcopenia has been a big issue. I think that we have a great opportunity in long-term care to replace some and find some plant-based alternatives, because most of the patients that I encountered really weren't interested in eating meat anymore for a variety of reasons. They had chewing problems, they had digestive problems. So I was interested in the part of your book that discussed this and talked a little bit about leucine and supplementation, even if it came to that. Do you know in Canada or in the United States for that matter, if anybody is trying to supplement with, let's say, the scoop of soy or leucine supplementation?
No, and I don't think they are, but definitely I think it's an appropriate step to consider. And for those that aren't familiar with this, leucine is one of the 3 branch chain amino acids, and it plays a very important role in stimulating protein synthesis. And so for muscle maintenance and for muscle building, it's an especially valuable amino acid. But it's so interesting if you look at, even trying to get 2,000 or 3,000 milligrams of leucine per meal, it actually is quite possible. Leucine isn't as concentrated in plant foods, but it's still very possible to get it from plants. And one of the things when we were writing the book that really surprised me was the leucine concentration in seitan. And seitan coming from wheat, it's actually one of the highest or richest sources. And it's something that's so digestible and quite easy to prepare. I think it would be a very reasonable addition to the diet of seniors because it's fairly easy to chew and so on. Same with tofu. Tofu is a wonderful, easy, digestible food for seniors as well. But yeah, and I remember, it's so funny, I was helping one of the very large groups that runs a lot of senior centers in the States, and they were wanting to begin to offer more plant-based foods. And I remember going to a meeting with a lot of their residents and asking them, and they had no idea, what my perspectives were. But I just asked them if there were any changes you would like to see in your food. What would they be? And I thought people would be saying, well, we want our banana cream pie to be a little thicker and, whatever. And I was so shocked that people were saying, I wish we could have, brown rice instead of always having white rice. And I wish sometimes there would be veggie burgers instead of hamburgers, because I know hamburgers aren't that healthy for me. And, they were saying so many things that really surprised me. And so I think we really need to at least be open to offering plant-based alternatives for people in homes, and I think we'll be surprised at what happens.
I agree, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying earlier, small changes, you and Cory both, that small changes can make an impact. And I think that we can reach a lot more people that way, because a lot of people feel threatened when they're told, oh, eliminate animal-based protein completely, or eliminate your fuel vehicles completely. People get defensive about that. But if we can show what an impact small changes have, I think we would see a lot more people slowly getting on the wagon there. And I think
I so agree with you, Laura. And I think it's one of the things that I think is a little bit sad within the plant-based or vegan community is that sometimes there's this all or nothing perspective.
Yeah.
And I think that hurts us in the long run because, I think most human beings really want to make a difference. They want to make good choices. And so I believe so much that we need to be more inclusive, and we need to be really congratulating people for every little baby step they make, and then take another little baby step and introduce them, share food, introduce them to something that may be exciting to them, and no judgment, just whatever. Whenever you make a conscious decision that is in the right direction, that will benefit you, will benefit your family, will benefit the world, it's worth celebrating. And I think we really need to do that more. Yeah.
Thank you.
When we started Chat and Chew, Brenda, what it was all about was just eat more plants. And that was 12 years ago. So, we've come a long way, and we're out there to say, look, here's what's down the line. And, look at these health results that come when you keep going down that line. And we have ways, and we try very hard to show people that look how good it tastes, and those kinds of things. So yes, I think that's a very good point. Cory, on what I was wondering about was the chapter that dealt with, I can't even remember which chapter I was reading now, but you talked about social issues and, you know, helping people along the journey is definitely a social issue. But you mentioned in your chapter that the countries that are producing the most destruction to our environment, to our climate, to our water loss, all that, we're suffering the least amount. That it's the populations of the world that are in situations that are much poorer than we are. And they're not creating all the damage, but yet they're getting the result of it. Can you speak to that for us?
Yeah, of course. I really appreciate this question because it's near and dear to my heart. Certainly, the most privileged nations in the world, meaning the nations who have the most money to spend, who can create the most impacts with that spending, are in the least vulnerable places in the world with regards to things like climate change. I mean, if we look at places like the Marshall Islands, who are at so much risk to flooding and natural disasters, but really have contributed very little to the greenhouse gas emissions globally. And the same is true in a lot of the third world countries. It really is the most vulnerable populations who are at the forefront of facing extreme climate conditions and natural hazards, I guess, even within our own countries. So even within Canada and even within the United States, it's our most vulnerable populations. For instance, Indigenous peoples here in Canada often are at the forefront of wildfires, flooding, and get hit hard with that, as it could restrict access out of their communities, can impact their water supply. Of course, in Canada, First Nation communities, Indigenous peoples here, are disproportionately impacted by water quality issues. And in terms of agriculture, and we could just take a snippet from the United States, where concentrated animal feeding operations are, or CAFOs, factory farms, they are disproportionately located in and around minority communities, who are then disproportionately impacted by the negative effects, especially with water and air pollution coming off of these operations. Now, for what we consume that's not within our countries, we essentially offset those impacts to other countries, right? And so there's countries out there that are producing a lot of soy to feed our chickens, like in Brazil, mostly sending it to places like China, where we get our metals from. Of course, there's impacts in the Congo for cobalt, where there's serious environmental concerns related to water pollution and human rights issues related to child labor. And that cobalt goes into components in China, then sold to our phone companies for our cell phones and things like that. So, of course, we consume products whose environmental impacts extend beyond what is accommodated within our national borders, and impacts other areas who might not have the regulatory capacity to enforce very strict environmental regulations, even if they have those environmental regulations, and who are essentially just geographically more exposed, more vulnerable to natural disasters. And in some of these areas, it's the children, the women, and the elderly people who are most vulnerable to these impacts. For example, in natural disasters, women are often more exposed because they're the ones getting water and wood and for their local villages in some of the developing world. And children are disproportionately impacted from water pollution as a result of natural resource development and agriculture.
And you know, Brenda, I found your video online that you did for Dr. McDougall on the Marshall Islands. And I'm going to put that in the show notes because that's a perfect example, I think, Cory, of what you're talking about.
Mhm.
Glad you brought up that even our own country that are poor populations. I mean, I think we've all heard about the big ponds that are made from the agricultural animals that are full of sewage, because they don't have septic tanks like we do, or sewer systems. And with lots of rain, what can happen with that when storms come in? That's another example of that. So
that's right. And actually, just quickly, it was last year a paper came out, I believe it was in Nature, showing how pollution and socioeconomic status, even in the United States, are correlated. Socioeconomic status meaning wealth, degree of disability, etc., access to healthcare, access to education, are disproportionately impacted by pollution within our own borders. It just seems to play out that way.
And all we need to do to get started on helping with that is changing out that little egg for some legumes. That would give us a good start. That sounds great. Brenda, one of the things that, we've talked a lot about, well, yes, you can get enough protein if you eat enough calories, and you've done that very well. The amino acids that we need, those specific ones, I've heard you talk about diversity, and I think one of the things that we have heard in the past was that thing about complementary. And Laura, can you come back in and talk a minute about the complementary protein?
Yeah, as an educator, some of the textbooks are still talking about that, still talking about how we have to complement proteins. And, I think one of the refreshing things about your book is getting the word out that no, just eat plant-based foods and don't worry about that. I think we've also lost a lot of people, who would choose a plant-based meal here or there, or even more often, if they weren't concerned about how they were doing it and what they had to match and getting the right amount of protein. And I think we need to change our mindset as, as dietitians even, because we're so, especially those of us that were educated in the 80s and are maybe writing textbooks still, that that doesn't have to be that way. It can be fun and easy. Just eat plants and enjoy it.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't realize one of the, this whole idea of protein complementation, I think it was in the either late 70s or early 80s with Frances Moore Lappé's Diet for a Small, was it Diet for a Small Planet?
Yeah.
And it wasn't 10 years after she wrote that book that she said, actually, I made a mistake and I was being overly cautious. And the reality, of course, is grains do tend to be low in methionine and cysteine, and legumes tend to be sometimes, tend to be low in lysine, and legumes tend to be a little bit low in methionine and cysteine. So the thinking was, well, if you eat the grains, which are low in lysine, with the legumes, which are high in lysine, then you'll get all the amino acids you need. There's a couple of things that I think are really important to mention. One is all plant foods contain all 9 essential amino acids, every single one of them. So when we say they're lacking in essential amino acids, it's not that they don't have any, it's that the amount they have per gram of protein may be somewhat lower than what is needed. If, like, let's say an individual needed 50 grams of protein a day and all they got was 50 grams of protein, and they only ate one food, and the food was wheat, and wheat is low in lysine. Well, they would need to eat more wheat than, their caloric requirements to meet the lysine requirements. So, for example, wheat contains about, I think it's just over 20 milligrams of lysine per gram of protein, and children need about 38 or 58, and adults need about 38 according to the RDA. So you can see per gram of protein, they'd be a little bit low. Now, the reason I'm going into all of this is because I think it's really important for people to realize that legumes are slightly low in methionine, but what a lot of people don't realize is that the slightly is so slightly that if you were needing 50 grams of protein and all you ate was legumes to get your methionine needs met, you might need to eat 2 tablespoons more or a half a cup more or some small amount more to completely meet your methionine requirements. And the reality is just really simple, that if you are eating a variety of plant foods and you're getting enough calories, you tend to meet your requirements for all of those essential amino acids. And that's why we make food guides and say, eat foods from each group. And ideally, if you eat the variety at each meal, that's ideal. And it doesn't always have to be a big bowl of beans. Legumes are providing the lysine that is, may fall short if you're barely meeting your protein needs. But, it could be soy milk at breakfast. It could be some sort of lentil soup at lunch and tofu at dinner. It could be peanut butter. It could, there are a lot of legume foods that can contribute. And I'm not sure if I made myself clear, but it's just we made this more complicated than it needs to be. We just need to be eating a variety, and it helps to include legumes, which are especially important sources of lysine.
Well, a go-to for me is the chickpea smash. I also love the peanut noodle. Very, very delicious.
Okay, well, I'm that one in my book to take a look at then. That sounds good. Brenda, how about you? Are there any in here that you really like?
I really love the Gadogado. So it's a really fun meal. So and the picture of it's gorgeous too. It's on the cover there. But basically, you take a bunch of vegetables, some raw, some steamed. Yeah, it's got the tempeh in the middle. I usually have tofu because I'm not a huge fan of tempeh. I mean, it's wonderfully nutritious, but it can have a little bit of an odd flavor for some people. But and then you serve all of this with a peanut sauce, and it's just so yummy. So that's one of my favorites. But I love an awful lot of the recipes there. So in this book, we tried to really focus on making the meals very, really quite high in protein, so they'd be suitable for athletes and for seniors and for people that are just trying to get a little bit of extra protein in their day.
That sounds great. Well, the tofu fingers sounded good too. So
they're really good. Oh, when Cory was little, I used to make tofu fingers, and we would just dip them in tamari or something like that, and then bread them with nutritional yeast. And he used to call them Kentucky Fried Tofu.
It was one of my favorites.
Yeah. And they would want Kentucky Fried Tofu for snacks. They love. But my kids were unusual eaters too. And one of my favorite stories is one time when my daughter came upstairs to ask what she could have for a bedtime snack. I said, "Oh, we'll just take a look in the fridge." And she looked and she said, "Oh, Grandma, a pack of spinach." And she said, "Mom, could I take some spinach?" I said, "Sure, go for it." And she took out the frying pan and got out the fresh garlic and cooked her spinach with the garlic. And she's sitting at the table with her mound of spinach, and she's pouring the fresh lemon juice on top. And just as she's doing that, Cory's walking upstairs, and he's about 6 years old. And he looks at her and he goes, "Oh, is that spinach?" And she said, "Yes." And he said, Well, can I have some?" And she said, "Oh, sorry, there isn't any more." Eating a lot, and he burst into tears.
That's the end of the journey when we've got children like that. Oh my gosh.
We had to go digging in the fridge. I think we might have found some kale or something.
That's still like somewhat of a comfort food for me.
Oh.
Garlic spinach with fresh lemon.
those tofu things that you did you cook them in the oven or you just dipped them in the, is that all you
Yeah.
did?
So basically, Vasanto and Cory have these air fryers. And so do you do your tofu in the air fryer now, Cory? Not really?
Not particularly.
So I always do it in the oven because I don't have an air fryer, but Vasanto really likes doing it in the air fryer. And she does a big batch of these little tofu cubes, and that's one of her main snacks. And of course, Vasanto's 81 years old, and she's quite focused on making sure she gets enough protein. But yeah, I usually do it in the oven, and that works beautifully as well.
Okay, well, speaking of tofu, we got one last question, and that one is, in fact, we're going to have one of the doctors from PCRM the end of the year, our year, which is in May, speak on bone health. And a lot of seniors, I know that's a big concern. And some of us have followed Dr. McDougall a lot. And so we've listened to him talk. And he mentioned that maybe our standards for how much calcium we need are high, and that other populations that they get along fine without it. So can you speak to that? Like for seniors, do they really need 1,200 milligrams of calcium?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is a really important question. And one of the things that I think people need to realize is bone health is not simply a product of calcium intake. It's a really multifactorial. It's based on your level of physical activity, the amount of weight-bearing exercise you do, your intake of calcium and vitamin D and magnesium and potassium and zinc and vitamin A and, just so many nutrients. Even B12 plays a role, even omega-3 fatty acids, boron, and, on and on. Vitamin K2 is important. So all of these things are really important. And so your risk will depend on so many different factors, whether you smoke, it just goes on and on. Now, I think it's important to recognize that if we look at hip fracture risk, just for example, there have been 4 studies since 2020 and several meta-analyses that have looked at risk of hip fracture in people consuming different dietary patterns. And so, the one that really raised eyebrows was Epic Oxford in 2020, where they showed that vegans had a 2.3 times higher risk of hip fracture than non-vegetarians. And the vegetarians had about a 25% higher risk. Even the pesco-vegetarians or pescatarians had a 26% higher risk. And so that was one study. And then the Adventist Health Study too found about a 55% higher risk in vegan females. There was no difference in the vegan males. And then there were 2 studies from the UK, the UK Biobank study and the UK Women's Cohort study, that found between about a 33 and 50% increased risk in vegetarians and vegans combined. They didn't separate out the vegans and vegetarians. But there's definitely, the evidence is definitely showing that there's greater risk among plant-based eaters. And just to put it into perspective, in Epic Oxford, the increased 2.3 times increased risk in vegans would be about 15 more hip fractures per 1,000 people over 10 years. So it's not a huge number, but it's still, it's still significant. Now, what's really interesting is in Epic Oxford, which was the one that, showed the worst results. They didn't observe a higher risk in vegans with a BMI over 22.5. It was only in very thin vegans that they noted the higher risk. And generally, we don't see a much higher risk among men either. And so, why the higher risk? Well, definitely lower body mass index. And that is consistently vegans have, the lowest BMIs, but within a healthy range. But they're, interestingly, the Adventist Health Study, vegans were actually the only dietary category that were within the healthy BMI range of everybody else was above. The lacto-vegetarians, everybody had a BMI above 25. So on average, the group on average. But vegans tend to have lower intakes of calcium, vitamin D, protein, zinc, vitamin B12. So these are nutrients that we just need to make sure we take care of because they're all important to bone health. One of the other reasons in Epic Oxford that, was sort of put forward as a possibility is vegans tend to do less hormone replacement therapy, and they also have lower IGF-1 levels, all of which could, somewhat increase risk. But I think, the bottom line is that, to just give a personal example, and I'm 64 years old, I haven't had my bone density done for a while, but when I was about 50, I decided, and this was before I was, a postmenopausal woman. I was still, still a premenopausal state. But my mom developed osteoporosis around the age of 50, so I thought I'll have my bone density done. And I had been vegan for 20 years, and my bone mineral density in the lumbar spine was 2.5 standard deviations above the young adult mean. And my right femur was 2 standard deviations above. And just for people that don't know, osteoporosis is at least 2.5 standard deviations below the young adult mean. So I was so much on the opposite end of the spectrum, they couldn't even plot me on the chart. They had to put an arrow above the chart. My doctor was absolutely stunned. He just couldn't believe that, not eating dairy for 20 years and I could still have such strong bones, especially when I had a family history of osteoporosis. But the reality is I've always made exercise a priority. I exercise every day, and I do meet the RDAs for calcium. I make sure I get enough vitamin D. I take a supplement. I live in Canada, so there's going to be 6 or 8 months of the year at least that my body's not going to be making much vitamin D. I meet my recommended intakes for protein. I eat 12 or 14 servings of fruits and vegetables a day. I design my diet to make sure I'm meeting my needs for magnesium and potassium and all of the other important nutrients. I include isoflavone-rich foods like soy foods, all of which can actually be protective. And so it's not that you can't have strong bones as a vegan or as a plant-based individual. But I think we don't need to just assume that we don't have any risk, we do have lower risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes and all of these things, but we don't have a lower risk of osteoporosis and hip fractures. And so I think we need to just pay attention to that. And I know an awful lot of vegans who do have low, osteopenia or osteoporosis. And so I think it is an issue. And to me, it does a disservice to the vegan community when we say, oh, don't worry about that, when we really should be paying attention to it at the very least. So, because to me, I guess the way I look at it is that as plant-based eaters, we are on trial in the eyes of the world, and we will be until we have kids that live their entire lives as vegans. And what we need to do is make sure we're meeting our needs, make sure we do well, because if we don't, it's used as exhibit number 1 for why people are justified in eating meat. We need to make sure that we take seriously the nutrients, the B12, whatever nutrients that tend to be shortfalls for vegans. There are a lot of nutrients that we get way more of than the average omnivore. Think about vitamin C and potassium and folate and all of these nutrients. But there are several nutrients that we tend to consume less of. And so we just need to be looking at the diet and seeing how can we take care of that. Just take care of it. And if vitamin D is an issue, if B12 is an issue, then we take a supplement if that's what we need to do. And generally, that's what we need to do for B12 for sure. And for vitamin D, especially those that live in cooler climates, that's what we need to do as well, as do almost, pretty much everyone needs to do that. So
I think I heard the prescription you just gave us. So we need to exercise. And tofu is a good way if we get the right kind of tofu. What'd you say about the tofu that would be good for us to
Tofu actually has a number of advantages. It's an exceptional source of protein. But it's also a good source of several of the nutrients that helps with building bones, but it's also a rich source of isoflavones. And isoflavones can act kind of like as weak estrogens and may actually be somewhat protective for bone health as well. So there's, there are a number of components in soy foods that can be, and years ago we used to say, protein, you don't want too much protein because it causes urinary calcium excretion. And so you want to be lower on their protein for bones. And now we know it's the exact opposite. It's true that, protein can increase calcium excretion, but it also helps with calcium absorption. And overall, I think in the, the balance of things, it actually is protective. And there are several studies showing that especially when we look at plant-based eaters, those who are getting more protein have lower risk of osteoporosis than those who are consuming less and fractures.
Yeah, that's the first time I've heard you say that. So if those that are eating the most plant protein and getting adequate amounts of it, then we are also at the same time reducing our osteoporosis risk. Is that what you?
Yeah, and actually there was one study that was quite interesting on women in the Adventist Health Study too, where they were looking at even sources of protein in terms of, legumes versus veggie meats, for example, which are quite popular in the Adventist community. And what they found was that even, you lose calcium in the urine with sodium intake as well. But even with the higher sodium veggie meats, it was still protective. The women that were consuming more protein from veggie meats had far fewer fractures than those who were consuming less protein. And those that were consuming protein from legumes did the very best. The lower sodium and higher protein was a really good mix.
Yeah, that makes sense. The lower sodium too.
Yeah.
Well, this has been absolutely wonderful. You've given us so much good information and insights into who you are. We've enjoyed that too, because it reflects out in your personalities and in your work. And we really appreciate what you're doing for us personally, but also for the world. So thank you both. And thank you, Laura, for joining us, because your perspective really is helpful. It's good to know those nutritionists are excited about this and are even talking you into it.
It's great to be here. Thank you. It was a wonderful event. Nice to meet you both.
Thanks. It's really, really nice to meet you, Laura. Thanks so much for being with us. And thanks so much, Kathy, for having us. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah. Thank you, Cory. And y'all keep doing good.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.